feet, saying that he would return later with reinforcements and take all of his magical items. The protagonist turned his back to the man, noting that if he tried to harm anyone else, he should not expect mercy. The mage looked at the protagonist in shock, after which he bowed before the protagonist again, thanking him. Lloyd stood with his back to him, pressing his lips together. He imagined the image of the swordsman behind the mage. Lloyd noted that in the novel, Xavier forgave Ruffalan and left the cave. The protagonist presented the image of the disfigured mage, noting that Ruffalan then killed hundreds more innocent people and experimented on himself, and he turned into an uncontrollable and annoying villain who challenged Xavier again and again. Lloyd took a step, noting that even though he knew about it, he now turned his back on him because the mage's face was hidden under the hood. Ruffalan peered out from under the hood with a terrifying look. Lloyd stood with his back to the man. The mage opened his mouth wide, creating a magic circle. He approached the protagonist with a mad smile, preparing to attack him. Lloyd looked behind him, looking at the mage with a frightening look. He asked the man if he had ever forgiven him. Ruffalan looked at the protagonist in bewilderment. The brown-haired man thought that he knew from the very beginning what this would lead to. Xavier attacked the mage, cutting off his head. Ruffalan's head bounced off the air. The man in the work uniform looked ahead with displeasure. He told the guy that he was nothing but trash, rotten to the core, and when he greeted him, he should bow 90 degrees, asking if he understood. The protagonist noted that there was a dude who constantly swore for no reason. Lloyd remembered himself in his real world when he nervously looked ahead. He noted that it happened every damn time. The brunette bowed to the man, apologizing to him, noting that he would be more careful in the future. The worker told him to keep his back straight. Lloyd noted that there was nothing wrong with that. One should avoid quarrels, one fight leads to another. The man turned his back to the guy, saying that the youth of their day have to be taught everything, and all they themselves know how to do is eat. The protagonist noted that if he was polite, then he would change. With such thoughts, he tried to put up with the situation. A beautiful orange sunset was visible in the sky. Lloyd asked what this led to. The brunette bowed to the man, greeting him. The guy stood motionless in a bent position. The man asked what he was at the demonstration, noting that he almost went deaf. The protagonist noted that he saw him as a punching bag. The man turned his back on the guy, saying how pathetic he was. Lloyd gritted his teeth, thinking that he needed to hold on and it would all be over soon. The guy bared his teeth, thinking that he needed to restrain himself, and if he made a scene himself, he would only suffer more and he needed to relax. The worker stood with his back to the guy, saying that only a worthless mother could have such a worthless son. The protagonist widened his eyes in rage. The guy put his hand on the man's shoulder, after which he bared his teeth and swung his fist. The brunette hit the man in the face. The workers looked back, watching what was happening, not understanding what had happened. Lloyd punched the man in the face, after which he hit him again. The brunette kicked the man in the stomach. He noted that while he was hitting him, there was only one thought in his head, that he was doomed. The workers ran up to the guy, stopping him. The guy was carrying pipes on his shoulder. Lloyd asked what the result was. The guy looked ahead in surprise. The man looked at the protagonist with horror. Then he turned his head to the side. The brunette stood motionless, looking at the man leaving. The protagonist noted that peace had come. The protagonist turned his back to the dead body of the magician. He noted that sometimes he should stop any violence, wondering if everything would be okay then. The protagonist recalled the news on TV. He noted that there were a lot of serial killers and rapists in Korea, wondering why the most vicious criminals escaped punishment, and perhaps it was all about human rights. Ruffalan's head was lying on the ground. Lloyd thought it was funny, but then the villain should get what he deserved. The sun was shining brightly in the sky. The guys were walking along the road in the forest. The man was carrying a backpack on his back with an exhausted look. The protagonist looked back. The worker looked at the young gentleman in surprise. The brown-haired man said to give him his load before he collapsed. The man began to refuse the offer. The protagonist narrowed his eyes, saying that if he felt bad, he would have to carry both of them, so he should give it to him quickly. The sun's rays were breaking through the trees. The young master said that all the men should quickly hand him their backpacks, noting that this was an order. The workers looked at the young master in confusion, saying that they would carry them themselves, and how could such a noble man do this? The protagonist threw the backpacks on his back, saying that whoever was the most troublesome would not receive additional pay. Tears appeared in the worker's eyes. Xavier watched what was happening in bewilderment, thinking that he did not know whether they made it in the backpacks themselves or that he was genuinely concerned about the well-being of the soldiers, and he did not understand him at all. The soldiers looked at the young master with touched expressions. The knight thought that the truth was not important to the soldiers now. Lloyd carried the backpacks with a serious look. The swordsman thought that a leader they could trust and follow. That's what the soldiers thought of young Master Lloyd. The system announced that the freed soldiers were deeply touched by his actions, and after some time, stories about him would be passed on by word of mouth. The protagonist pursed his lips. The system asked if it wasn't lovely. The protagonist looked ahead irritably, asking what was lovely, noting that he didn't need anything except money. The weather was clear above the orc tribe. The iron doors to the stone cold storage were open. Harach looked around the room with curiosity, saying that this was the cold storage. The chieftain's son looked up uncertainly. He looked behind him, saying that it was only slightly cooler there than outside and the meat would quickly spoil, and their muscles would lose their former strength. Lloyd said that it was only for now and that was obvious. The protagonist smiled widely, noting that it was because there was no ice and they weren't done yet. The chieftain's son looked at the young master in confusion, saying that he knew what ice was and it was hot there, so there was no ice there. The brown-haired man smiled widely, saying that if not, they could make it themselves. Harach frowned in confusion, looking at the brown-haired man, asking how. The young master continued to smile, saying that whatever. Harach looked at the protagonist warily. The brown-haired man continued to force a smile onto his face. The orc narrowed his eyes, wondering if he had brought home a crook and maybe the story about the queen was a lie. The protagonist smirked slightly. The system notified that Harach was not as stupid as he thought. Lloyd said for the system to close, and he never ever thought that it was just her thoughts. The system said that it was not at all, and it was he who thought he was stupid. Lloyd noted that the level of sympathy was still much more important, or rather, the client was more important. Harach began to shake his head from side to side. He thought that Lloyd had saved him, and he should not have thought badly of him. The young master waved goodbye to the orc. The chieftain's son said that if he needed help, he could call at any time. The protagonist told him not to worry and wait until the work was finished. Xavier looked at the protagonist with curiosity, asking where they would get ice. Lloyd stood motionless with his hand raised, after which he looked back in confusion, saying that he was also interested in where. Xavier looked at the protagonist in bewilderment, noting that these were the eyes of a man who did not know what to do. The knight looked at the young gentleman with concern, asking him that he had signed a contract without a concrete plan and that he was going to cheat them. The swordsman's eyes widened in surprise. Lloyd asked if he knew the first signs of failure. The protagonist slightly opened his mouth, saying that he couldn't do this, he couldn't do that. He held his hand out in front of the knight, saying that there would definitely be a lot of reasons, so there was no need to act like that, and that without trying, you wouldn't know if it would work or not. The protagonist looked at the swordsman with a confident look, saying that the one who would succeed would be the one who would be open to everything new and try to fix the situation. Lloyd clenched his hand into a fist, saying that he called this innovation. The young gentleman raised his fist, noting that these were the thoughts of a true entrepreneur. The brown-haired man stood motionless in front of the swordsman. Xavier looked at the guy with indignation, thinking that this was impossible and that such an undertaking had a higher chance of failing. A full moon was visible in the night sky. The protagonist looked thoughtfully ahead while sitting on a rock. The protagonist closed his eyes, thinking that everything was right and that he would first make a huge ice cube. Lloyd imagined Belle and Peepodong pouring water into a container. He noted that Peepodong and Belle would first bring water from the lake. The protagonist imagined the image of a magician who had conjured ice. He noted that ice magic existed in this world, wondering what its principle was. The brown-haired man rested his head on his fist. He thought about magic and the free use of mana and a technique based on freely changing the flow of mana. The brown-haired man imagined the image of a particle of magic. He noted that he was sure that this was possible due to daily training in absorbing mana and that there were several types of natural mana. Orange particles of mana moved in space. A bright flash of mana occurred in space. The protagonist noted that in this way, changes depended on the nature of mana. The young master pressed his lips together, after which he grinned mischievously, thinking that of course he couldn't use mana as he wanted. Peepodong and Belle were moving towards the protagonist, who was calling them. Lloyd leaned towards the water container, thinking that he could do something similar. The young master dipped his hand into the water, thinking about a Srahan's mind technique, absorbing mana. The protagonist spread his fingers in the water, noting that if he took away all the heat energy, then only cold energy would remain in the water. Blue particles of energy floated towards the young master's palm. Lloyd noted that he did everything the other way around, and it wasn't that easy. Xavier leaned towards the wall, crossing his arms over his chest. He watched the scene intently, thinking that he was being open-minded and trying to fix the situation, and he thought he was being unreasonable. The knight pursed his lips, thinking that he was also being irresponsible. The protagonist was gathering magic particles with a concentrated look. The swordsman noted that he was really trying to find a way out with dignity. Xavier sighed heavily, thinking that he couldn't understand him. A blue aura began to emanate from the protagonist. The system notified that he had developed a new skill thanks to a Srahan's mind technique. The system notified that the level had increased, a Srahan's mind technique double rings level 2. The sun was shining brightly in the sky. A couple of days later, Akuch and Harach looked at what was happening in surprise. There were ice cubes in the room. The chieftain asked what he had gotten the ice from. The brown-haired man tapped his hand on the ice, saying that everything would be ready as soon as they installed the insulation. The orcs looked at the ice happily. Akuch noted that there was a lot of space there and they would no longer have to throw away meat. Harach noted that they would no longer have to hunt every day. Lloyd watched what was happening with a satisfied grin. The chieftain said that they should celebrate and that Harach should gather the people. The chieftain's son said that it was wonderful. The young gentleman looked at the knight with a sly grin, after which he raised his index finger, thinking that these were the thoughts of a true entrepreneur. Xavier closed his eyes and spread his arms out to the sides, noting that he was not arguing. The weather was clear above the orc tribe. The chief said that their Steel Sand tribe thanked him. The protagonist slightly bowed, saying that there was no need for gratitude and that he was only following the terms of the contract. Lloyd Frontera got 120 workers. Akuch pressed his fist to his chest, saying that they, orcs, were different from humans and they did not do this for the sake of a contract. Thole looked at the guy with a serious look, noting that because they were sincerely grateful to him, that is why he, Akuch from the Steel Sand tribe, promised him. The chief stood in a pompous stance, saying that from now on, the Lloyd Frontera family and the Steel Sand tribe. The orcs showed off their muscles, clenching their hands into fists. Akuch said that he was announcing an alliance that was stronger than blood ties. The boys looked at the orcs in confusion. The chieftain looked at the young master with a confident look, noting that they proclaimed Frontera as their friend. Frontera's enemies were their enemies, and if he needed them, he should just call and they would come. The protagonist looked at the system window in surprise. The system notified that the tribe had become available and the orc tribe had accepted him as a true friend. The system notified that he could strengthen his kinship by using the orc's RP, bonus RP for opening the tribe plus 100, the amount of RP was 611. The protagonist's mouth dropped open in surprise. He clenched his fist and smiled broadly, saying that the Steel Sand tribe was cool. White clouds floated above the ground. Lloyd noted that they had once again set off on a long journey and returned home. The villagers watched the events in shock. The protagonist noted that, of course, the people were shocked. The protagonist was walking in the company of orcs. He noted that watching 120 units of living muscle come to the village. The young gentleman smiled in confusion, thinking that he should write an official appeal to calm the people down, because most often orcs are seen in a bad light. The protagonist's parents watched the crowd of orcs in horror. The young gentleman noted that even though the Baron was aware of his wanderings, he froze in place as soon as he saw the orcs in person. The system notified that the wonderful story of defeating the magician and saving the soldiers had spread throughout the area and the inhabitants of the estate were praising him for his noble courage. The system notified that he had received bonus RP for achievements in society plus 300, the amount of RP is 911. The young gentleman noted that besides, he did not even hope to receive a bonus, and he asked to stop praising him, but thank for the RP, there were vials of liquids on the table. The protagonist noted that the Baron said that he would look for a rich buyer to sell what they got from the orcs and only the magic things of Ruffalan remained. The protagonist looked at the golden sphere with curiosity, after which he began to dig into the book. Xavier asked if he found anything that could be sold. The protagonist said that he did not know, and he was trying to figure out if they could use them as something before selling them. The protagonist looked at the book in shock, wondering what it was, after which he abruptly jumped up, saying that he urgently needed to go to the mines and let him clean up after him there. The protagonist ran along the road to the mines. He began to frantically look around, asking where Thords was. Thords approached the protagonist with an exhausted look, asking what he was looking for. The young gentleman said that he had good news. The guy looked at the young gentleman with an exhausted look. Lloyd asked if he remembered the details of their contract and that he would have to work for him for 520 years. The worker said that he remembered. The brown-haired man smiled widely, asking in fact, what was the point of this, noting that all these conditions were too ridiculous. Thords looked at the brown-haired man in surprise. The protagonist said that now he had nothing to worry about. The hero pointed to the book, saying that it said how to revive a dead person. Thords looked at the protagonist in bewilderment. The main character smiled widely, saying that this meant that he would still be able to work the entire term, asking if he was happy and wasn't it fun. The guys stood motionless, looking at each other. Lloyd looked at the guy with a terrifying look, asking what was funny only to him, ordering the guy to smile. The worker looked at the young gentleman in a daze, after which he smiled widely as tears flowed from his eyes. The young gentleman winked at the guy, telling him not to be so sad. Lloyd walked to the exit raising his fist up, telling him to be cheerful. The system announced that the King of Hell himself was impressed by his efforts and was already thinking of offering him a job. Lloyd told him to slam it shut, asking what was so funny about it. The protagonist walked with a wide smile. The system agreed with the protagonist. White clouds floated above the estate. The brown-haired man walked along the corridor of the building, thinking that now he needed to discuss something with the Baron. The main character looked into the room, wondering why he was not there. The maid approached the young gentleman, saying that the Baron was receiving guests in the hall. Lloyd asked about the guests. The protagonist stared at the servants. The girl said that Mr. Shalo and Meatloaf were there. The protagonist continued to stare at the girl, after which his face twisted into a mad smile. The girl wondered what was wrong with his face. There was a beautiful candlestick hanging on the wall. Meatloaf said that as he already knew, he usually did not require the principal amount of the debt to be repaid in a lump sum. Arcus sat opposite the men, leaning slightly. Meatloaf said that, however, this time they could allow him to pay 10% of the debt. Meatloaf smiled maliciously, saying that if he transferred the ownership of the mine to them. The Baron looked down nervously. The man asked why he was silent, noting that for him this was the best offer. The Baron looked at the door in surprise when the protagonist said it was him, asking if he could come in. Arcus said that he could, of course, come in. The protagonist with a wide smile and looked into the room, saying what kind of meeting is this, asking how they are doing. The man with a displeased face showed the paper to the protagonist, said that if he came to threaten them again, then it is better for him to leave immediately since they have permission. The brown-haired man said that who would doubt it and how smart it is. The young gentleman smiled widely, saying that it can be concluded that they complained with a very good offer, asking nothing if he makes a counteroffer. Meatloaf looked at the guy with irritation, said that he is not going to listen to this idiot. The protagonist said that in the future they will pay off the debt in installments, but of course they cannot lower the interest. The enraged man pointed his finger at the protagonist, saying that he does not want to listen, asking how dare he. The main character smiled widely, asking what can be offered, but he cannot, adding that he is furious. An orc's leg appeared in the room. An enraged Harach appeared behind the protagonist, asking who had angered his brother Frontera. Meatloaf and Shalo looked at Harach in horror. The chieftain's son incinerated the men with a furious look. He said that the Steel Sand tribe would destroy anyone who made Frontera suffer. Lloyd smiled widely, lightly hitting the orc on the chest. He asked his friend what he was talking about, noting that nothing terrible had happened. The chieftain's son said that it hadn't happened at all, and that he looked angry. The protagonist noted that the man had simply raised his voice a little. Shalo and Meatloaf were shaking in horror. Lloyd told them to ignore him, asking how they liked his offer. The young master continued to smile, saying that if they refused him. Harach looked at the men with a terrifying look, while the protagonist smiled madly. The brown-haired man said that he would be deeply offended. Harach said that if they dare to upset Lloyd, he would tear them apart. The two men ran out of the estate in horror. The protagonist held a paper in his hands, looking at it. He said that he would like to make it so that there would be no more for a long time, but this is impossible, so he must be content with what he has. The Baron thanked the protagonist. The young master looked at the defense with a smile, saying that orders for the construction of the system are growing, and coal mining is in full swing, and they will be able to quickly pay them off. Brown-haired handed the paper to Arcus, noting that he should not lose this contract. Arcus looked at the protagonist in surprise. The hero said that they have worse problems, and if they do not solve them, then they will have a hard time. Brown-haired pointed his finger at the chieftain's son, saying that the orcs consume 10 times more food than they do. Arcus looked at the protagonist in horror. The young gentleman noted that their food expenses were no joke, but they would not be able to let them go. The menacing orc swung the poker. The protagonist noted that, as he had expected, orcs made excellent miners.